Okay, so in this chapter we're kind of shifting gears and we are going to be talking about exponents and exponential functions. So the first half of this chapter just covers the properties of exponents. So in this lesson you're going to learn about zero and negative exponents. So we are going to simplify expressions involving zero exponents and expressions involving negative exponents and some expressions that involve both. So the first property we are going to learn about is the property of zero and negative exponents, which is this whole lesson is based off of. So zero as an exponent states that for every non-zero number, a to the 0 power is 1. So, an example, 4 to the 0 power is 1. Negative 3 to the 0 power is 1. An important distinction there is that negative 3 to the 0 power inside parentheses is different from negative 3 to the 0 power without the parentheses. That is negative 1. So these are not the same. I'll explain that more in depth later on. Final one, 5.14 to the 0 power, that's also just 1. So really anything raised to the 0 power is just 1. That's an easier property to remember. The harder property to work with is using a negative exponent. This states that for every non-zero number a and an integer power n, a to the negative n power is 1 over a to the n. So to explain this, if you see something raised to the negative power, that means you write it as the reciprocal. So an example of that, 7 to the negative third power, the reciprocal would be 1 over 7 to the third power, 7 to the positive third power. The next example, negative 5 in parentheses to the negative second power becomes 1 over negative 5 to the second power, which really becomes 1 over negative 5 squared is 25. So really simplifying that fully, it would make this 1 over 25. But it's more understanding when you see a negative power, write that power as a reciprocal. So a negative exponent means you rewrite your power as a reciprocal. So we're going to get some practice with that in example 1. In example 1, we are going to rewrite 9 to the negative second power. Seeing that that exponent is negative, we're going to write this as a reciprocal. 1 over 9 to the second power, which is really 1 over 81. All right? In part B, negative 3.6 to the 0 power is just 1. I want to really emphasize that these two are not the same. Okay? This side becomes 1. This side, it becomes negative 1. That parentheses makes a world of difference because this parentheses says negative 3.6 to the 0 power. Without the parentheses, this expression says negative 3.6 to the 0 power, then multiply by negative 1. So in your calculator, these will be different numbers. So that parentheses makes a huge difference. So for number 1 in our guided practice, you've got actually 5 kind of short problems to work with, but I want you to pause the video, try to simplify these the best you can, and then resume the video when you're ready to see the answers. Okay, so for a, I would rewrite that as the reciprocal, 1 over 4 to the third power, which is really 1 over 64, because 4 to the third power is 64. Part B, this becomes 1, and it's 1, positive 1, because the negative 5 is in parentheses. For part C, 3 to the negative second power becomes 1 over 3 to the second power. 3 to the second power is 9, so 1 over 9. Next one, reciprocal, because it's a negative power. 1 over 6 to the first power is 1 over 6. For E, 1 over negative 4 to the second power, 1 over 16. So the main thing that I want us to understand is that when we raise something negative, so like negative 4, to an even power, means a multiple of 2, that is going to result in a positive number. Okay? If I raise a negative number to an odd exponent, that is going to result in a negative number. And we will cover those more specific examples more in depth throughout this chapter. So right now, just understand that parentheses makes a difference. Example 2 is just simplifying a little bit more complex expressions. So in example 2, part A, we are just looking at this as a fraction, okay? I can just write this as being over 1, okay? I'm going to take all of the things being raised to a negative power and create the reciprocal. Now, 5 is not being raised to a negative power, so I don't need the reciprocal of 5. A is not being raised to a negative power, so I do not need a reciprocal of a to the third power. B is being raised to a negative power, so I would need to have the reciprocal of b squared, which just means I put b squared on the bottom of the fraction. So positive powers do not need the reciprocal. Negative powers only. So only b was being raised to a negative power. In part B, looking at this as a fraction, 1 is not being raised to a negative power, so I can keep 1 on the top. X is being raised to a negative power, so the reciprocal moves x to the top of the fraction. So when I talk about reciprocals, it's kind of like you're moving a fraction from the top to the bottom or the bottom to the top. So this actually simplified. I mean, the 1s can kind of go away, be eliminated. It's just x to the 5th power. So it's understanding what a reciprocal really means. A reciprocal takes a power and moves it to the top or the bottom of a fraction. If it was on the top, it goes to the bottom. If it was on the bottom, it goes to the top. Only the things being raised to negative powers. So in the guided practice, same drill. I'd like you to work through those, pause the video, work through them, and then when you're ready, look at the answers, ask questions if you don't know. You can email me, but we will cover more of this when I'm back in class. Now in these examples, I'm just going to put a little star next to E because I haven't showed you quite how to simplify those types of expressions yet. So if you didn't understand E, that's really okay. The other ones are the ones I more want you to understand. A, it's going to be the reciprocal because x is being raised to a negative power. So I write 1 over x to the 9th power. B, n is being raised to a negative power, so the reciprocal would be just n to the 3rd because I technically move n to the top of that fraction. In C, 4 and b are not being raised to negative powers, so they stay on the top as a fraction. C is being raised to a negative power, so it is the reciprocal, it gets moved to the bottom of the fraction. In D, 2 is not being raised to a negative power, so it stays on the top. A is being raised to a negative power, so we have the reciprocal, it gets moved to the top from the bottom. In E, it's just knowing that n squared stays on the bottom, n to the 5th moves to the bottom. There is a way to simplify this more, but I want to cover that later. I don't want to cover this right now because this is a separate lesson. It's enough to know these first two properties for right now. So, kind of the last thing I want to cover in the notes, I won't do the word problem quite yet. I want to do that when we're in class, is just evaluating exponential expressions for given values of variables. So the value of this expression when s is 2 and t is 3, I want to really show that when you substitute things, you put them in parentheses. It is extremely important that you put these things in parentheses. So to simplify this expression, just to get everything out in the open, 3 and 2 are not being raised to negative powers. So these two parts of the expression, these two factors, stay on the top. Negative 3 to the 2nd power, we need the reciprocal because it's a negative power, so it gets moved to the bottom. So to simplify this, this becomes 3 times 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. On the bottom, negative 3 squared is positive 9. Negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9. So this becomes 24 over 9. I can divide both of those numbers by 3 to get this as a fraction simplified. Divide 24 by 3, you get 8. Divide 9 by 3, you get 3. So substitution, understanding the properties, and then essentially you can use a calculator to simplify this. But you need to understand when we substitute, put the thing you're substituting in parentheses because that can change the whole outcome of the expression. So, for these notes, this guided practice is the last thing you will do. So, take your time to pause the video, work through these carefully. When you're ready, resume the video. When I'm done explaining, you can move on to the next step in the lesson. Okay, so my opinion, these are the toughest problems to do because you need to know the properties and you need to be comfortable evaluating an expression. So, in part A, substitute, use parentheses when you substitute. Negative 2 is being raised to a negative power, so it gets moved to the bottom. 5 is raised to the 0 power, so it stays on top. It becomes 1 over 16. In part B, negative 2 is being raised to a negative power, so the way I explain it, it gets moved to the bottom. 5 squared stays on the bottom because it's raised to a positive power. So this becomes, in the end, 1 over negative 50, or negative 1 over 50. The whole fraction is negative. The whole fraction is one number. 1 over 50 is not two separate numbers. It is one number. The one after that, C, negative 2 to the 0 power becomes positive 1. 5 to the 6th power becomes 15,625. 15,625. So that's the simplified version of that expression. And then the last one, 1 over negative 2 times 5 to the negative 1st power. Only 5 is being raised to the negative power, so only 5 gets moved to the top, so it becomes 5 over negative 2. So here you are going to get some practice evaluating because that part is very important to evaluate variable expressions because that helps you calculate things like car depreciation, interest on a loan, return on an investment. These are important things to understand when using exponents. So I will save example 4 for next class because I'd rather explain that to you in person. I just want you to practice the properties and substitution. So you can move on to the next part of the lesson. Reference your notes often. Email me if you have questions. If you get to anything in the practice that doesn't make sense, I can help you now through email or I can help you in person when I'm back. I'll be back during tomorrow's classes, Thursday. So if you have a study hall, you have come down, get help if you need it.